The morning sun hit the glass facade of Lee Tech Industries with a blinding, clinical glare, making the entire building look like a fortress built of cold light. Thomas Miller stood by the rear door of the black Maybach, his posture straight despite the weight of the years pressing down on his shoulders. He wore a black suit that was clean and pressed, but if you looked closely at the cuffs, you could see the faint fraying of a garment that had been washed one too many times. He ran a microfiber cloth over the door handle, obsessed with removing even the slightest smudge. To the world passing by on the busy Seattle sidewalk, Thomas was just a shadow, a utility, a piece of equipment that came with the car. Mr. Chen stepped out of the lobby, his presence preceded by the sharp, rhythmic click of Italian leather shoes on the pavement. He didn't look at the sky, and he certainly didn't look at Thomas. His eyes were glued to a sleek tablet, his brow furrowed in a permanent expression of high-stakes irritation. Beside him scurried Linda, the operations manager, her high heels snapping like gunfire against the concrete. She was clutching a designer handbag in one hand and a smartphone in the other, already filming a live story for her social media followers about the hustle culture of the elite. Thomas opened the door with practiced precision. "Good morning, Mr. Chen," he said, his voice low and respectful. Chen didn't respond. He simply slid into the cream-colored leather interior, the smell of his expensive, musky cologne instantly overpowering the neutral scent of the car. Linda lingered for a second, looking Thomas up and down with a sneer that suggested she had just smelled something rotting. "Watch the suit, Thomas," she snapped, her voice nasal and sharp. "It costs more than your house. If you even think about getting a hair on it, you're done." She slammed the door before he could answer. The drive was silent, punctuated only by the aggressive tapping of Chen's fingers on his tablet. They were 5 minutes away from the most important merger meeting of the year when a distracted teenager, eyes glued to a phone, stepped directly into the path of the 3-ton vehicle. Thomas's reflexes were instant. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the car jolted to a violent, shuddering halt. The teenager looked up, pale with terror, and scurried away, but inside the car, the damage was done. A paper cup of artisanal espresso, which had been resting in the center console, flipped through the air like a slow-motion disaster. The dark, scorching liquid splashed across the front of Mr. Chen's $5,000 light gray silk suit, soaking into the fabric and drenching the original, hand-signed merger contracts resting on his lap. For 3 seconds, the silence in the car was deafening. Then, the explosion came. "You incompetent, mindless animal!" Chen screamed, his voice cracking with a rage that seemed to vibrate the windows. He didn't just look angry, he looked disgusted, as if Thomas were a stray dog that had just ruined his life. "Look at this. Look at what you've done." Thomas looked into the rearview mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I am so sorry, sir." A pedestrian ran into the... "I don't care about the pedestrian," Chen roared, lunging forward to grab the back of the driver's seat. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea what these papers are worth? You are a driver. You have one job. One. And you can't even handle a steering wheel without acting like a peasant in a tractor." Thomas pulled the car to the curb, his hands shaking slightly as he shifted into park. "I saved that boy's life, Mr. Chen. If I hadn't braked, you should have hit him." Chen spat, the words dripping with a cold, terrifying elitism. "It would have been cheaper than this suit." The door flew open as they reached the curb in front of the firm's satellite office. Linda was already there, having followed in a separate car. She ran over, her face contorting into a mask of theatrical outrage as she saw the stain on Chen's chest. "Oh my God," she shrieked, instantly pulling out her phone to record Thomas. "Look at this. This is what happens when you hire people with no pride, no class. You're pathetic, Thomas. Honestly, people like you are the reason this country is falling apart. You're lazy, you're clumsy, and you're useless." Chen stepped out of the car, looking down at Thomas with a chilling level of contempt. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a checkbook, and scribbled a number with a jagged, angry motion. He ripped the check out and tossed it onto the wet, oil-stained pavement at Thomas's feet. "That's your final pay," Chen said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet hiss. Scavenge it off the ground where you belong and never let me see your face again. You're fired. Actually, you're erased. Go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of. A small crowd of employees and passers-by had gathered, whispering and snickering as they watched the prestigious Mr. Chen humiliate his driver in broad daylight. Thomas stood there, the cold wind biting at his neck. He looked at the check sitting in a puddle of dirty rainwater, then he looked up at the man he had once known as a friend. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He simply reached down, picked up the wet paper, and tucked it into his pocket with a slow, deliberate dignity. I guess the test is over, Thomas whispered to himself, his eyes hardening as he watched Chen and Linda storm into the building. It's over much sooner than I thought. The rain-slicked streets of the present seemed to dissolve into the sterile, fluorescent haze of a San Francisco hospital 10 years earlier. Back then, the air didn't smell like wet asphalt and expensive car exhaust. It smelled of industrial disinfectant and the metallic tang of desperation. Thomas Miller didn't wear a driver's uniform then. He wore a crisp, charcoal gray suit that screamed authority, his name etched in gold on the glass doors of Miller Systems. He was at the top of the mountain, but his heart was in that hospital room. Across from him sat a much younger, much more fragile version of Mr. Chen. The man was a ghost of his current self, his shoulders slumped and his eyes bloodshot from weeks of sleeping in waiting room chairs. Chen's mother lay in the bed behind them, her breath rattling in her chest, a victim of a failing heart and an even more failing bank account. Chen was an immigrant with a brilliant mind but zero capital, caught in the gears of an American healthcare system that didn't care about his IQ. I can't lose her, Thomas, Chen had whispered, his voice cracking as he stared at a stack of medical bills that might as well have been a death warrant. I've worked so hard. I came here with nothing, and now, even my work isn't enough to keep her alive. Thomas hadn't hesitated. He didn't see a competitor or a subordinate, he saw a human being in pain. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a check that would cover the entire surgery, plus 3 months of recovery. Consider it an investment in a friend, Thomas had said, sliding the paper across the table. You've got a gift for code, Chen. The world needs your mind. Your mother needs her son. Don't worry about the money. Just build something great. That act of kindness had been the spark that lit the fire of Chen's empire. But as the months turned into years, the gratitude in Chen's eyes had slowly curdled into something else. Ambition is a hungry thing, and for Chen, it became a monster. He didn't want to be the protégé anymore. He didn't want to be the man who owed his success to a handout. When the tech market took a jagged dive years later, Chen saw his opening. He didn't reach out a hand to the man who saved him, he sharpened a knife. He orchestrated a hostile board takeover, leveraging Thomas's own generosity against him, painting Thomas as too emotional and financially reckless for the new era. Thomas had watched his life's work be stripped away by the very man he had saved from the gutter. But instead of fighting in the mud, Thomas had walked away with his head held high. He spent his remaining millions not on lawyers, but on a secret foundation for veterans and families who had been chewed up by corporate greed. He chose a life of quiet service, eventually taking the job as Chen's driver under a different legal name just to see if the soul he had once invested in was still in there somewhere. He wanted to know if the monster he created could ever be a man again. The memory flickered and faded as Thomas pushed open the door to his cramped, one-bedroom apartment. The smell of cheap floor wax and old wood replaced the hospital's sterile scent. In the corner of the small living room, his daughter Sarah sat in her wheelchair, her eyes lighting up at the sound of the door. Her legs hadn't worked since the accident that took her mother, and the specialized physical therapy she needed cost more than a driver's salary could ever provide. "Hey, Daddy, you're home early," she said, her voice like a bell in the quiet room. "Did you have a good day with the big boss?" Thomas walked over and kissed her forehead, the sting of Chen's insults still burning like acid on his skin. He looked at a framed photo on the mantel, a picture of him and Chen, young and smiling, on the day they launched their first server. Chen had his arm around Thomas, looking at him with genuine worship. "I had a very enlightening day, Sarah," Thomas said softly, his eyes moving to a locked metal box beneath his bed. He realized now that the investment he made 10 years ago had reached its maturity. Chen hadn't just forgotten the road he came from. He had tried to pave over the people who built it. Thomas reached into his pocket and felt the damp, crumpled check Chen had thrown at him in the rain. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was the final piece of evidence. Thomas knew the merger Chen was so desperate to sign was a trap set by wolves even hungrier than Chen himself. For 10 years, Thomas had played the role of the martyr. But as he looked at his daughter's hopeful face, he knew the time for silence was over. The driver was about to take the wheel. The morning after the firing brought no peace, only a sharper, more jagged edge to the nightmare. Thomas was standing on the sidewalk outside his apartment, his hand resting on the handle of Sarah's wheelchair, when the shrill, unmistakable chirp of a police siren cut through the air. A cruiser pulled abruptly to the curb, blocking their path. Behind it, a white luxury SUV drifted to a stop, and Linda stepped out with the practiced grace of a woman who spent her life rehearsing for a spotlight she didn't deserve. She didn't just walk, she marched, her designer heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown. Her phone was already out, held aloft like a weapon, the recording light glowing a predatory red. "That's him, officer," Linda shrieked, her voice cutting through the quiet morning like a jagged blade. "That's the thief. I told you wouldn't get far with his little sob story." She turned the camera toward Thomas, her lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered triumph. "Do you see this, everyone? This is what happens when you try to be charitable to people who have nothing. They don't just fail you, they rob you blind." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser. "Officer, I don't know what she's talking about," he said, his voice steady but laced with a growing sense of dread. He felt Sarah's small hand tighten around his thumb, her knuckles white with fear. "Oh, don't play the victim now, it's honestly pathetic," Linda snapped, stepping closer until Thomas could smell the cloying, sickly sweet scent of her expensive perfume. "Mr. Chen's limited edition Patek Philippe watch went missing from the center console the second you were fired. It's worth more than your entire life, and strangely enough, it disappeared right as you were making your grand, dramatic exit. Check his bags, officer. Check his pockets. I'm sure he's got it tucked away for a rainy day." The older of the 2 officers, a man with tired eyes and a heavy sigh, looked at Thomas and then at the trembling girl in the wheelchair. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the chair and put your hands on the hood of the car," he said. Thomas complied, the cold metal of the cruiser biting into his palms. He watched in silent, burning humiliation as the officers began to sift through his belongings. They pulled out Sarah's medical charts, a few crumpled napkins, and a small, wooden toy Thomas had carved for her. Linda watched the search with a hungry intensity, her eyes darting around like a hawk looking for a kill. Standing near the entrance of the Lee Tech lobby, watching the entire scene through the glass doors, was Marcus. He was a young security guard, barely 22, who had spent the last 6 months sharing his sandwiches with Thomas in the break room. Thomas had been the only one who bothered to learn his name. Marcus watched as Linda shifted slightly, her hand hovering near the open trunk of Thomas's car where the officers were now looking. In a blur of movement that happened so fast Marcus almost missed it, Linda dropped a shimmering, gold object into the corner of a tattered gym bag. "Hey, wait a minute," Marcus whispered to himself, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the security monitors, then back at the street. He knew what he had seen. He knew Linda was framing the only man in that building who treated him like a human being. But then he looked up and saw Mr. Chen standing on the mezzanine, watching the arrest with a cold, detached satisfaction. If Marcus spoke up, he'd lose his job. If he stayed silent, an innocent man would go to prison. "I found it," the younger officer called out, holding up the gold watch. It glinted cruelly in the morning light. Linda let out a triumphant, high-pitched laugh that sounded like glass shattering. "I knew it, you absolute lowlife. Stealing from the man who gave you a job. You're going away for a long time, Thomas. And don't worry about the kid. I'm sure the state can find a much better place for her than a thief's apartment." Thomas felt a surge of white-hot protective rage, but he forced it down, his eyes meeting Marcus's through the glass. The young guard looked away, his face flushed with shame. The handcuffs clicked into place, the cold steel a final, crushing weight on Thomas's wrists. As they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, Linda leaned into the window, her face inches from his, her expression one of smug, untouchable arrogance. "You thought you were someone, didn't you?" she whispered so only he could hear. "But look at you now. You're exactly what we always knew you were. Nothing." The cruiser pulled away, leaving Sarah crying on the sidewalk and Linda standing there, basking in the glow of her own malice. Thomas sat in the dark, cramped backseat, the sirens wailing in his ears. He closed his eyes, not out of defeat, but out of focus. The injustice was afire, and he was letting it temper him. He didn't need to fight her with his fists. He needed to let her think she had already won. The trap was finally set, and Linda had been the one to spring it. The cold, sterile walls of the interrogation room seemed to close in on Thomas, the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights buzzing like a trapped hornet. Across the metal table, the detective tossed a clear plastic bag containing the gold Patek Philippe. It landed with a dull thud. "Possession of stolen property over $5,000, Thomas. That's a felony. You're looking at serious time," the detective said, leaning back with a look of exhausted disappointment. Thomas didn't flinch. He sat with his handcuffed hands resting calmly on the table, his expression unreadable, almost serene. He wasn't looking at the watch. He was looking at the camera in the corner of the room, knowing exactly who was likely pulling the strings to ensure the charges stuck. But then, the door opened, and a lawyer in a suit that cost more than the detective's annual salary walked in. He didn't speak to the police. He handed over a single piece of paper, a high court injunction. Behind him stood Marcus, the young security guard, his face pale but his eyes burning with a newfound courage. "I saw her do it," Marcus stammered, his voice gaining strength as he looked at Thomas. "I have the raw footage from the auxiliary drive. Linda didn't just find that watch. She planted it." The detective's brow furrowed as he reviewed the tablet Marcus handed over. The video was undeniable. Linda's frantic, sneering face as she tucked the gold watch into the gym bag while the police were distracted. Within minutes, the cuffs were unlocked. The thief was free, but Thomas didn't move. He rubbed his wrists slowly, the red marks fading, and looked at his lawyer. "Don't file the countersuit yet," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of chilling command. "I want them to think they've won. I want them to feel invincible." Thomas returned to his apartment that evening, not as a broken man, but as a general preparing for the final assault. He walked past the meager furniture and sat at his small kitchen table, opening a hidden compartment in the base of an old, battered briefcase. Inside lay an encrypted USB drive, coated in a layer of dust. For years, he had kept this as a memento of his former life, a fail-safe he hoped he would never have to use. He plugged it into his laptop, the screen reflecting in his pupils as lines of complex code and financial ledgers began to scroll. As he analyzed the data, a dark, sharp smile touched his lips. He discovered something far more explosive than simple embezzlement. Mr. Chen was so desperate to finalize the merger with the Dragon Group that he had forged the intellectual property rights to the core algorithm. It was the very algorithm Thomas's father had spent 40 years developing, the one Chen had stolen during the hostile takeover. Chen wasn't just arrogant, he was a fraud. He was about to sell a lie to the most powerful investors in the world, and if the deal went through, the company would collapse under the weight of the inevitable lawsuits, wiping out the pensions and livelihoods of thousands of innocent workers. Thomas's mindset shifted entirely. The humble driver who took the insults and the coffee spills was gone. In his place was the visionary CEO who had once built an empire from a garage. He didn't feel like a victim anymore. He felt like a predator. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in a decade, the personal line of the chairman of the Dragon Group in Hong Kong. "Hello, old friend," Thomas said, his voice steady and cold as ice. "I believe you're about to sign a contract with a man who doesn't own what he's selling. How would you like to see the real books?" For the next 6 hours, Thomas didn't sleep. He worked with a feverish, surgical precision, mapping out the legal leverage that would not only clear his name but dismantle Chen's entire world. He watched the news on his small TV, seeing a clip of Linda and Chen laughing at a charity event, celebrating the removal of the criminal element from their staff. They were mocking him on a national stage, completely unaware that the man they had discarded was currently holding the detonator to their careers. Thomas looked over at Sarah, who was sleeping soundly in the next room, and made a silent vow. He wasn't just playing for justice anymore, he was playing for the legacy Chen had tried to bury. The long game had begun, and Thomas was 3 moves ahead before Chen even knew he was in a match. The following weeks were a study in contrast, a silent war waged in the shadows while the surface of the world remained oblivious. Thomas spent his days in the quiet, dust-moted corners of the city's public library. To any casual observer, he was just another out-of-work man killing time, huddled over a flickering laptop screen. But beneath the humble exterior, a digital architect was at work. He navigated through layers of corporate filings and encrypted bank statements with a surgical precision that would have terrified Mr. Chen. He lived on black coffee and the fierce, quiet hope he saw in Sarah's eyes every time he returned home. He wasn't just looking for a way back, he was building a gallows for the corruption that had taken over his father's legacy. While Thomas worked in the dim light of the library, the high-rise offices of Lee Tech were bathed in the golden glow of unearned victory. Mr. Chen moved through the corridors with a newfound swagger, his chest puffed out as if he had personally vanquished a great enemy. He spent his afternoons in the penthouse lounge, swiveling his chair toward the panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, sipping a 30-year-old scotch that cost more than a driver's annual salary. To him, Thomas Miller was a ghost, a minor nuisance that had been successfully exorcised. He laughed with Linda over expensive lunches about how easy it had been to crush a man of that stature. Linda was in her element, basking in the reflected glory of Chen's cruelty. She spent the company's marketing budget on a lavish, new era, rebranding campaign, all while funneling kickbacks into her private offshore accounts. She would sit in her glass-walled office, snapping her fingers at her assistants and checking her diamond-encrusted watch every 5 minutes. "Did we get the confirmation from the Dragon Group?" she would bark, not even looking up as she buffed her nails. "I want everything perfect for the gala. We've finally cleared out the trash, and I want this company to sparkle like the elite institution it is." She felt untouchable, convinced that her little framing stunt had buried Thomas so deep he'd never see the light of day again. But the cracks were already forming in their golden ceiling. Every few nights, Thomas met Marcus in the flickering shadows of a parking garage. The young guard was terrified, his eyes darting toward the security cameras, but he kept showing up. He handed over internal memos, shredded documents he'd painstakingly taped back together, and digital logs that proved Linda had been bypassing the board's approval for months. "You're doing the right thing, Marcus," Thomas told him, his voice a calm anchor in the young man's storm. "Justice isn't always fast, but it is inevitable." Back at the apartment, Thomas spent his nights meticulously repairing his old tuxedo. It was a garment from a different life, made of the finest wool, draped in memories of boardrooms and gala speeches. As he ran a needle and thread through a small tear in the lining, he wasn't just fixing a suit, he was reclaiming his identity. He practiced his Mandarin in the quiet hours, the tonal language rolling off his tongue with a fluency that would eventually strip the mask off Mr. Chen's face. He wasn't just a driver anymore, he was a man who had seen the bottom and was now rising with the weight of the truth behind him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Thomas received a coded confirmation from his contacts in Hong Kong. The Dragon Group wasn't just interested, they were horrified by the evidence Thomas had provided. They agreed to play along, to let the Golden Gala proceed exactly as Chen planned. Thomas sat back in his creaky wooden chair, the blue light of the laptop illuminating a face that had aged 10 years in 3 weeks, yet looked more powerful than ever. He looked at the single share of Lee Tech stock he had purchased with his last remaining savings, the golden ticket that gave him legal entry into the lion's den. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the villains were currently popping champagne to celebrate their own upcoming funeral. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a shimmering cavern of excess, draped in gold leaf and illuminated by crystal chandeliers that dripped like frozen rain from the ceiling. The air was thick with the suffocatingly sweet scent of expensive orchids and the heavy, musky trail of $500 colognes. This was the Golden Gala, the night Mr. Chen intended to cement his legacy by signing the merger of the century. Waiters in white gloves glided through the crowd of tech titans and international socialites, carrying trays of champagne that bubbled like the reckless optimism of the elite. Mr. Chen stood at the center of the room, looking every bit the conqueror. His tuxedo was a masterpiece of Italian tailoring, and his smile was as sharp and cold as a diamond. Beside him, Linda was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She wore a gown of shimmering crimson silk that trailed behind her like a spill of blood, her neck draped in a diamond necklace that she had likely purchased with the company's misallocated funds. She clutched a flute of vintage crystal, her eyes scanning the room for anyone she could look down upon. "It's almost poetic, isn't it?" Linda whispered, leaning into Chen with a sneer. "3 weeks ago, we were dealing with that pathetic driver, and tonight, we own the city. I hope he's watching the news from whatever cardboard box he's living in." Chen let out a dry, arrogant chuckle. "People like Thomas Miller are just background noise, Linda. They exist to serve, and when they stop being useful, they disappear. He's probably forgotten my name by now, just as the world has forgotten his." Outside, a humble yellow taxi pulled up to the curb, clashing violently with the line of pristine Ferraris and Rolls-Royces. The door opened, and Thomas Miller stepped out. He didn't look like a driver anymore. He had spent hours pressing his old tuxedo, and though it was a decade old, the quality of the wool and the perfect cut of the shoulders commanded a presence that transcended fashion. He walked toward the entrance with a quiet, terrifying confidence, his gaze fixed straight ahead. At the velvet rope, Linda spotted him. Her face went from triumphant to murderous in a heartbeat. She dropped her champagne glass onto the marble floor, the shatter echoing through the foyer. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that made the nearby socialites turn in confusion. "Someone call security, now." She marched toward Thomas, her finger pointed at his chest like a bayonet. "How dare you show your face here? This is a private event for people who actually contribute to society, not for thieving, low-life losers who couldn't even keep a driving job. Do you have any idea how embarrassing you are? I'll have you arrested for trespassing before you can take another step." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't even look at her. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out an official shareholder's invitation. "I hold a voting share in this company, Linda. Under the corporate bylaws, I have every right to be at this meeting. Perhaps if you spent less time planting evidence and more time reading the employee handbook, you'd know that." "Mr. Chen pushed through the crowd, his face flushing a deep, angry purple. "Thomas," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "You think you can walk in here and humiliate me? I offered you mercy by not pressing charges after the theft. Now, leave before I make sure you never work in this town again. I'll give you $100 right now if you just turn around and park the cars outside where you belong." The room went silent as Chen pulled a $100 bill from his wallet and let it flutter to the floor. The socialites began to snicker, pulling out their phones to record the fallen driver being mocked by his former boss. The atmosphere was thick with a cruel, mocking tension, the kind that precedes a public execution. But then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A group of men in dark, impeccably tailored suits entered, led by a silver-haired man with an aura of immense power. The snickering stopped instantly. It was the Dragon Group delegation from Hong Kong, the very investors Chen had been courting for months. Chen's face transformed into a mask of desperate fawning as he rushed toward them, his hand extended. "Chairman Wang, welcome. We were just dealing with a small security issue." Chairman Wang didn't even look at Chen's hand. He walked straight past him, his eyes locked on the man in the 10-year-old tuxedo. The entire room held its breath as the most powerful investor in Asia stopped in front of the driver. To the absolute horror of Chen and Linda, Chairman Wang bowed deeply, a gesture of profound, ancient respect. "Chairman Miller," Wang said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "It has been far too long. We have reviewed the files you sent. The Dragon Group is ready to proceed according to your instructions." The color drained from Mr. Chen's face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. He stood there, his hand still hanging in the air, looking between his former driver and the billionaire investor as the reality of his own destruction began to settle over the room like a shroud. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the breath out of the lungs of everyone present. Mr. Chen stood paralyzed, his hands still awkwardly hovering in midair as Chairman Wang's deep bow to Thomas Miller sent a physical shockwave through the crowd. The snickers and whispers died instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. Linda's face, once flushed with the crimson heat of arrogance, turned a sickly, translucent white. Her hand trembled so violently that her replacement champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble with a sound like a gunshot, but no one even looked at her. Thomas Miller stood tall, his shoulders broad and his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been seen in a decade. He didn't look like a driver. He looked like a king reclaiming a stolen throne. He stepped toward the podium, and the crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knew exactly how this story ended. As he reached the microphone, he looked down at Mr. Chen, who was now sweating profusely, his expensive silk suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "I believe you were offering me $100 to park the cars, Mr. Chen?" Thomas's voice boomed through the speakers, no longer the soft, deferential tone of a servant, but the commanding baritone of a leader. "It's funny. 10 years ago, I gave you $100,000 to save your mother's life. I suppose the interest on that loan has finally come due." The room gasped. Thomas turned his gaze toward the massive projector screen behind him. With a single click of a remote, the New Era marketing slides were replaced by grainy, high-definition security footage. The entire room watched in stunned silence as the video played. Linda, her face contorted in a sneer, sneaking toward the driver's side of the Maybach and dropping a gold watch into a gym bag. Then, the screen shifted to a series of financial ledgers, highlighted in bright, incriminating red, showing millions of dollars being siphoned from the company's pension fund into an offshore account titled, Linda L. Ops. "This is a lie," Linda shrieked, her voice cracking as she looked around for an escape. "This is a deep fake. You're just a disgruntled employee trying to ruin our reputation." But Thomas wasn't finished. He switched to the final slide, the core source code for Lee Tech's flagship algorithm. He began to speak, but not in English. He spoke in fluent, flawless Mandarin, addressing Chairman Wang and the Dragon Group delegation. He explained how the patents had been stolen, how the books had been cooked, and how the merger was nothing more than a giant shell game designed to rob the investors and leave the workers with nothing. Mr. Chen's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, right on top of the $100 bill he had tossed at Thomas earlier. He scrambled toward Thomas, his hands reaching out to grab at his trousers, his eyes leaking tears of genuine terror. "Thomas, please. I was desperate. The market was failing. I'll give it all back. I'll make you the CEO. Just don't tell them. Don't let them take me away." Thomas looked down at the man who had once been his protege, the man who had laughed while a police officer handcuffed him in front of his crying daughter. He felt no joy in the sight, only a profound sense of justice finally being balanced on the scales. He stepped back, avoiding Chen's grasping hands. "You didn't just fire a driver, Chen. You tried to destroy a man's dignity because you thought he was too small to fight back. You forgot that the people who build the roads are the ones who know exactly where the traps are hidden." At that moment, the heavy doors opened one last time. 4 federal agents in dark windbreakers moved with surgical efficiency through the crowd. They didn't go for the driver. They walked straight to the podium. Linda tried to run, but Marcus, the young security guard, stood firmly in her path, his arms crossed and a look of quiet pride on his face. The handcuffs clicked, the same cold, metallic sound that had haunted Thomas's dreams for weeks. As they led Chen and Linda away in front of the flashing cameras of the world's press, Thomas picked up the $100 bill from the floor. He walked over to a stunned waiter who had been mistreated by Linda earlier in the night and tucked the bill into his pocket. "Keep the change," Thomas said quietly. "It's going to be a long night, and you've earned it." The ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of applause, but Thomas didn't stay to hear it. He turned his back on the cameras and the millionaires, walking out of the hotel and into the cool night air, where the only thing that mattered was waiting for him at home. The chaos of the gala faded into a distant, muffled roar as Thomas stepped into the crisp night air, the heavy oak doors sealing behind him. The news of the arrest spread through the city like a wildfire, but Thomas didn't stop to check the headlines or watch the live streams of Linda being shielded from the cameras by her own silk gown. He took a long, deep breath of the damp Seattle air, feeling the weight of 10 years finally lift from his chest. He wasn't thinking about the millions he had just reclaimed or the corporate throne that sat empty. He was thinking about a small apartment and a girl who had never stopped believing that her father was a hero. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of legal filings and corporate restructuring. Linda found herself in a gray, windowless cell, facing 20 years for embezzlement and filing a false police report. Without her designer jewelry and the high-status perfume to mask her insecurity, she was just another inmate, discovering that in the real world, you can't speak to the manager to get out of a felony. Mr. Chen's fate was even more poetic. Stripped of his assets and his reputation, he became a cautionary tale in every business school in the country. The man who had mocked the working class was eventually seen, years later, sweeping the floors of a community center as part of his court-mandated service, finally learning the value of the labor he had once called trash. Thomas Miller, however, didn't return to the penthouse. He moved into a modest but sun-drenched home by the water, where the air was clean and the garden was full of life. He took over the company only long enough to sign the papers that turned Lee Tech into a worker-owned cooperative, ensuring that no driver, janitor, or assistant would ever be treated as replaceable again. Marcus was appointed as the head of global security, a reward for the young man who chose integrity over a paycheck. 5 years later, the sun was setting over a local park as Thomas sat on a bench, watching Sarah. She wasn't in her wheelchair anymore. Thanks to the medical advancements funded by Thomas's foundation, she was walking, unsteady at first, but with a grit that she had inherited from her father. She laughed as she chased a golden retriever through the grass, her movements a testament to the fact that the greatest wealth isn't held in a bank, but in the moments we fight for the people we love. A young man in a worn-out suit, looking stressed and disheveled, sat on the other end of the bench. He was clutching a folder of resumes, his eyes red from a long day of rejection. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a bottle of water, handing it to the stranger with a warm, genuine smile. "Tough day?" Thomas asked. The young man nodded, looking surprised that a man who looked so successful would even notice him. "Yeah, it's been a rough year," he admitted. "Sometimes it feels like nobody even sees you when you're at the bottom." Thomas patted the young man's shoulder, his gaze moving back to his daughter's joyful face. "I've been there," Thomas said softly. "Just remember, the world is a circle. Those you pass on your way up are the same ones you'll meet on your way down. Never judge a book by its cover, and never judge a person by the seat they occupy today. Because you never know, the person you're looking down on might just be the one who's been paving the road for you all along." The young man looked at Thomas, really looked at him, and for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. Thomas stood up, adjusted his jacket, and began to walk toward Sarah. He didn't need a Maybach or a driver to feel like a powerful man. He had his daughter, he had his name, and he had the quiet, unshakable peace of a man who knew that in the end, kindness is the only currency that never devalues. Karma doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes, it arrives with a simple act of mercy, proving that while money can buy a car, only character can drive you to where you truly belong.